It was Veronica Roth who said, "There are so many ways to be brave in this world. Sometimes bravery involves laying down your life for something bigger than yourself or for someone else. Sometimes it involves giving up everything you have ever known or everyone you have ever loved for the sake of something greater." Set in Kenya in the 90s, this is a story of grand corruption, a scammer and a whistleblower. David Sadera Munyakei was born in prison in 1968, but that is not the tragedy of his life. His mother was a worker at the prison. His tragedy would come many years later, which was his ultimate sacrifice for Kenya. David grew up in Olkuto, Narok County, in the abundance of nature. He lived side by side with the world's most majestic cats, the lions, also commonly known as Olgatun in the local dialect of Maasai that David was from. Narok is a bread and meat basket for Kenya. It's also home to one of a kind conservancy known as Mara Naboisho, a conservancy made up of leased land from the community. It attracts tourists from all over the world, and it benefits the more than 500 families who have leased out their land. This is where David grew up. So when every other Maasai boy wanted to be a Moran, David attended school. He passed all his exams and had great ambition. David's story would have been normal and without notice had it not been for this man who comes in next. They were age mates, but from different backgrounds, different fortunes, but as fate would have it, their paths would one day cross. In 1965, 3 years before David was born, Earth beheld another son, Kamlesh Mansuhal Damji Patni. He was born into a Hindu family in Mombasa. Like most Hindu families, his father was a businessman, a successful jeweler. My tongue can't say the word successful that fast, dealing with gold, silver, diamonds, and all ornamental rocks. Patni had a good education and a first-hand experience in business. When both boys were in their 20s, they moved to Nairobi, one to do business and the other one to find a job. You must understand that by 1990, Kenya had been under the rule of the late President Moi for 12 years. It was one party with rampant corruption and dwindling economic fortunes. There was constant and increasing pressure by the members of the opposition and the international community for the government to change. So in November of 1991, the Bretton Woods institutions and major bilateral donors unilaterally suspended further financial support to Kenya. They imposed conditions which included liberalization of the economy through the removal of various controls and the introduction of investment and trade incentives. David, in his juvenile innocence, had no way of knowing what was happening around him. To be fair to him, not many of his peers had an understanding of economics and how governance works. All he knew was that the times were hard, and finding a job and getting a decent income was the way to go. In any case, he had already gotten an opportunity to join the army. He wanted to be a cadet. He had been used to seeing his mother in uniform, and that career path kind of interested him. But when he got an offer to work as a clerk at the Central Bank of Kenya, he chose pen over the gun. His sight was set on becoming a great banker. He started working there in 1991. Patni was the complete opposite, an aggressive businessman who had learned from his father. He knew how to deal in gold, and even the gold smuggler's path from Congo was familiar to him. Obsessively possessed to oversucceed his father, and with a bottomless abyss of an appetite for money, by hook, and as in this case, by crook. The one factor that exemplified him from his peers was his sharp mind and irresistible charm. He knew about the economy, the current affairs, and his way around the corridors of power. He knew that Kenya's government was about to liberalize the economy and offer export incentives to businessmen like him. He knew this because one of his close allies was the head of Kenya intelligence, one Mr. James Kanyotu. Kanyotu headed the Directorate of Security Intelligence, famously known as the Special Branch, for 27 years from 1965 until he retired in 1991. He was a trustee of the president and, as speculation would have it, one of the masterminds of the biggest corruption scandals to ever rock Kenya. How Kanyotu and PATTNI met is still a mystery, but the fact that they met in 1990 shows the influence that young PATTNI wielded and how far back this scam had been thought. In his 1990 and 91 budget speech, read by the then Vice President and Minister for Finance, the late Professor George Saitoti, he implemented the recommendations of Sessional Paper 1 of 1996 to 1. Reward and compensate exporters through an export compensation scheme. 2. Advance easy loans to meet working capital needs of exporters through a CBK facility for rediscounting private financial paper. And 3. Commercial banks would allow pre-shipment finance scheme loans to exporters against confirmed and irrevocable letters of credit or confirmed and verified export contracts. In other words, exporters would be compensated for every dollar that they brought to the country with 20% incentive. They would also be given easy access to credit, and commercial banks would allow them to discount their letters. David was coping well at the CBK. His development department was not that busy. He was a diligent clerk. He would get vouchers from his superiors, verify that they have supporting documents, and forward them for processing. He would thereafter collect the processed vouchers for the day, file them in their respective files, and he'd be done. Life working at the CBK was more than a dream come true to him. At 23, and he was already sharing the washrooms with the CBK governor, he'd spend his evenings enjoying a cold brew at a terrace in a city bar. He'd watch the long stagecoach buses pick and drop Nairobians. He would also join his peers in discussing the political mood that was embroiling the country. The Shikukus, the Matibas, the Kibakis, the Odingas, these were all leading opposition leaders in the 90s. But David didn't care much about politics. At 7 p.m., he'd board his bus and retire to his abode. Then one night in August of 1991, at around 7 p.m., PATTNI was parking his Mercedes-Benz at the Hilton Hotel. He had had a busy day planning and scheming, meeting with the high and mighty in government while still trading gold and diamonds. Among the people he had met were the Vice President, the Commissioner for Mines, the Governor of the Central Bank, because all these people would be core pillars to his scheme. Or was it his scheme? The man he was meeting that night could easily have been the puppet master, the master of the operation, and probably the man who made sure that the master's interests were taken care of. It was James Kanyotu waiting for PATTNI. A year earlier, both Kanyotu and PATTNI had co-founded a company, the Goldenberg International Ltd. The company was intended to be an exporter and extractor of minerals in Kenya, key of them being gold and diamonds. The illegitimacy of this statement is that Kenya has no gold or diamond reserves for exploration, a fact the Commissioner for Mines and Geology knew very well. But he was also in the mix. Now, they needed to form another company to complete the ambitious plan that would net them 200 million shillings every month. By 8 p.m. that night, Kanyotu and PATTNI had a second company, a bank, the Exchange Bank Ltd. The Exchange Bank was proposed for application to Treasury the following day. That was before it was even incorporated as a company. Then 6 days later, the approval for it to be a bank was accepted. 2 months later, the company was formed with a nominal capital of 1 share each of 10,000 shillings, taken by PATTNI and Kanyotu. The 1992 elections were fast approaching, and the incumbent needed resources. These were the first multi-party elections in post-independence Kenya. The confidence in the Kanu regime was at an all-time low. The opposition movement was spreading fast, and it was widely hoped that Moi would be ousted. He therefore needed funds to oil a strong campaign machinery and crush the opposition, or a steady source of abnormal cash flows if he was to retire. Still, at this point, David and Patni had never met, but unbeknown to them, the paths had already crossed, and now it was only a matter of time before they impacted their lives. When David first met Patni, he had just assumed it was another Muhindi boy looking for someone in the building. But he observed further that his visits were regular, and the word going around among his fellow clerks was that Patni was going straight to the governor's office. This was what Patni was planning. He was discussing schemes with the governor, the people at the mining and geology department, and the people at the treasury. He wanted, 1, to make Goldenberg International Ltd a monopoly for 10 years. That is, the law would protect him from any competition. 2, give Goldenberg International Ltd an export compensation of 35%. That is 15% more than what the law had agreed at 20%. To use his personal bank, that is the Exchange Bank that he had already formed, to transact the money they'd be getting from CBK. The government, through the Minister of Finance, agreed to his demands, as this letter shows. Meanwhile, David's department was processing compensation for exporters. A completed CD3 form with evidence of duty paid was the mandatory documentation that David would review. He was also processing pre-export finance, the soft loans we talked about above, to enable exporters buy stock and export it, but on condition of export order documentation. The processing vouchers were numerous, but with little and manageable amounts. So far, everything that David did was according to book. Then, one day, in June of 1992, a new company's vouchers were dropped on David's desk. The amount excited David a little bit. He had not seen a request for such an amount before. The company had just deposited $500,000 into CBK after exporting gold and diamonds. David was excited that Kenya was finally exporting gold and diamonds. He was excited that Kenya was getting hard currency. The new company doing this was Goldenberg International Ltd, led by a young Mohindi, Kamlesh Patni. The following day he received another set of vouchers, similar high amount, which he dutifully processed. For every dollar, he was exchanging for the Kenya shilling equivalent plus a 35% compensation. That would mean if a dollar was exchanging at 100 shillings, he would exchange the dollar for 135. But as the vouchers came in daily, he started noticing that the vouchers were repetitions of previous vouchers, and some did not even have corresponding export documentation. He suspected fraud, but he was just a junior clerk, an entry-level employee with only 1 year's experience. He was a Maasai warrior at heart. He knew well to listen with his instincts when he smelled danger, but the moron in him was not yet ready to attack. At least, not yet. As David left for Christmas that year, he was a disturbed man. He had seen a lot of malpractice, and his bosses seemed eager to go on with it. He left for his rural home, back in Narok. He enjoyed his Christmas by telling stories to the Moran peers about the city. He drank with them his favorite brew and even considered taking a girl from the community. But no local girl looked anything like the ladies he had seen in Nairobi. Girls with long exposed legs, sensual bubbly looks, artistry makeup, and with very sweet tongues. The city was slowly getting into him. Soon it was elections time. The general elections were held in Kenya on 29th December 1992. Voters elected the president and members of the National Assembly. They were the first multi-party general elections in Kenya since independence. The results were marred by allegations of large-scale intimidation of opponents, harassment of election officials, and ballot box stuffing, as well as targeted ethnic violence in the Rift Valley province. But President Moi won with 36% of the votes counted. It was a 69% voter turnout. Little did David know, part of the money he had processed for Goldenberg International Ltd earlier that year could have been used to finance the militia wing of the ruling party KANU. It was chastened as the Youth for KANU Wing, YK92, led by university graduates and other connected youths. David would go back to work in January of 1993. He continued processing the payments. In his estimation, he had already paid Goldenberg Ltd close to 5 billion shillings in those few months. PATTNI's scam spree was now in full swing, or at least the first phase was. PATTNI was not exploring any gold or minerals. In fact, on 2 occasions, he smuggled gold from DR Congo and then smuggled it out of Kenya through Wilson Airport, denying the country any export duty. What PATTNI actually did was he'd borrow foreign currency from banks and friends, then deposit it in his bank. He would claim that those were proceeds from gold exports. For each dollar he deposited, he got the equivalent value in Kenya shillings plus a 35% compensation. So he would return the original value of the dollars to the lenders and keep the excess. He would also use his fake and pretentious export orders to obtain pre-export credit from banks. Some he'd pay, but most he didn't, causing the eventual fall of the Post Bank of Kenya. In mid of 1993, David's conscience could not allow him to continue processing the irregular payments. On the advice of a close friend, he made copies of the vouchers and presented them to 2 of the leading opposition MPs. One was Honorable Paul Moiti and the other was Honorable Anyang' Nyong'o. The 2 tabled the matter to Parliament. But not many could comprehend the magnitude of the scam or the structure of the plan. Its architects had hidden the blueprint with the same people who were the guardians of the public coffers. But there was a lot of heat, and eventually the export compensation and pre-shipment credit incentives were stopped. It is prudent to say at this point that David had eventually stopped a financial scam. He was the whistleblower. Had the scam continued at that rate for a year, the economy would have collapsed to a deplorable state. But what was the cost of his bravery? Unlike the fairy tale good ending of a heroic story, David's story would end in tragedy. His whistleblowing was deemed an act of sharing confidential information with a third party. He was arrested, kept behind bars, and found out that he had been sacked once he was released. Whether he breached confidentiality was not the issue though, but as small as a player he was, he had managed to block a siphoning channel. PATTNI did not vote in the 1992 elections, but in his testimony before Justice Bosire Commission of Inquiry, he stated that he financed the elections. He alleged that he was closely connected to former President Moi, his personal assistant Joshua Kulei, the former Vice President Professor George Saitoti, and many other KANU cabinet ministers, members of parliament, and party officials spread all over the country. According to PATTNI, it was agreed between him and the former president that he would directly and through his companies finance the 1992 general elections. PATTNI had a British passport and he flew often to Switzerland where he sold his gold. At this point, it's also important to note that contrary to the letter that had been approved by the Department of Mines and Geology, Kenya did not produce any diamonds, while the only gold reserve that it had were negligible mines in Kakamega. As David languished in uncertainty, PATTNI was enjoying the lavishness that comes with $1 billion bank balance. He was living in Kitisuru, where he often hosted dignitaries, among them Governor Eric Kotut. They sat by the poolside, smoking Cuban cigars and popping 1947 Cheval Blanc wine bottles. He used the proceeds of the scam to acquire, among other things, the Grand Regency Hotel and the Pan-African Bank. As at that date, it was estimated he had received 5.8 billion shillings directly from the Central Bank of Kenya. But as soon as the export compensation and pre-export credit services were discontinued, PATTNI would bounce back. Like an evil genius with even a deadlier plan up his sleeves, PATTNI would use his new bank for check kiting. What is check kiting? He would issue a check to himself, also a proxy. The check would be discounted immediately, but upon going for clearing, it would be dishonored for insufficient funds. He would then issue a similar instrument to cover the same. On 15th of April 1993, it was reported to the CBK governor that through Pan-African Bank, Post Bank Credit and Transnational Banks had exchanged 18 kite checks of about 10 billion shillings. These two banks would later go into liquidation. Why? You know the answer. I know by now you think that PATTNI's bag of tricks was done. Far from it. He had one last plan. Dollar contract selling. While it is legal and a method of getting foreign currency exchange gain, PATTNI falsified his dollar sale contracts. In other words, he wrote letters to CBK to exchange dollars for shillings. While the CBK delivered the shillings equivalent, PATTNI never delivered the dollars. In total, 249 million US dollars, the equivalent of 14 billion Kenya shillings at that year's exchange rate, went missing from the central bank. PATTNI had stolen that money. Mr. Kotut later resigned as the governor of CBK. In total, 158 billion was lost to PATTNI and his cronies, which at that time was 10% of Kenya's GDP. With such hard facts, it's easy to forget our main story. David Sadera Munyake as the hero and PATTNI as the villain. David became a spectator on the run. Everything else he did not satisfy him. The ghosts of a rotten regime would always haunt him. Even though there was a little glimmer of hope when a new reform-based government was formed in 2002, David's contribution was never recognized enough. But I feel that he should be in the history books. David sadly passed away on 31st July 2006. It is not unpatriotic to denounce an injustice committed on our behalf. Perhaps it's the most patriotic thing we can do. Said E. Buchianeri. I am Jeff Kafka. Until next time, keep watch.